So we've gone through and we've gotten most of the assets together. One last thing that I'd really like to add here is a slingshot, which is just a reasonably standard pinball asset. You'll recognize it once we start to get it in. And to do that, I'm going to need to just copy in the asset, same as before. So I'm just going to go to my assets folder and I'm going to pull up the asset to copy in, which is going to be called SM Slingband MT. So I'm just going to drag that in. And when it imports, I'm going to leave all of this the same. I'm going to auto-generate collision as well, and just click import. Now this asset has something different about it to the others, and what that is that if I was to open this up and quickly show you the materials, there are 3 materials for the surface and for the base sections, and then for this band running around the middle. Now this band around the middle has actually had morph targets applied to it, which is just a simple addition that we can add in 3ds Max that allows us to have kind of like a very, very basic pose saved into it, so a single animation as to where it would end up. And the reason for this is we, through the material, can modify these morph targets to actually expand the band out and pull it back in again to create that slingshot effect. So to do that, it's rather simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new material, and this material is going to be used as the morph band. So I'm just going to create that now. I'm going to right click, new material, m_morph band. And this morph band is going to be set up reasonably simply. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up first off the color, so I'm going to hit V and drop in a vector parameter, which lets me set a color that can be instanced. I'm just going to call this color. I'm going to set the roughness to be very low. 0 is actually probably good for this. And next up, I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in static morph, and you'll see that we have static mesh morph targets. So when static mesh morph targets is loaded, what it actually is doing is it can read in a final position. So if I was to get that position and run it into a world position offset, it actually lets me say where I want each vertice to end up in. So to do that, all I need to do is, if I was to just plug this in, it would end up in the final position that's been saved into the mesh. Now we're not going to see anything here because this sphere doesn't have anything saved into it. But I'm going to just plug that in for the time being so you can see it. And I'm going to hit apply and save. I'm also going to quickly just set this color to actually be something reasonable. So let's just go with like a yellow. That'll do. Save. Now all I need to do to test this out is I'm going to go to my Slingband MT. And I'm just going to send this bottom material to be my morph band. And you can see now that it's completely stuck out. So yeah, this has just popped out here. And if I was to unplug this and hit apply, it's now pulled back in. So what we need to do is get this parameter that allows the band to shoot out and basically just set it between a value of 0 and the final pose. So no morph target versus full. So to do that's rather simple. I have just held down L and left clicked to add a linear interpolate. So we call this a lerp. And I'm going to plug in WPO into the B channel. My alpha is going to be a scalar parameter that I add by holding down S and left clicking. So remember, a scalar parameter is a singularly modifiable value. So I drop this in. And I'm just going to call this %out. And initially that's going to be a value of 0. But if I was to push that up to 1, it would be popping out. So with that done, it's essentially all I really need done for this material, because we're going to be modifying it through the blueprint itself. So once again, I'm going to go pinball and I'm going to go blueprints, I'm going to right click and create a new blueprint class. And this is just going to be called BP_slingshot. And my slingshot asset is going to be reasonably straightforward. All I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up to have the static mesh of the sling. So add a static mesh component, set it to slingshot band. I'm now going to get this and I'm going to make it the root. Now we only really want the sling to pop out if it touches this here. So I'm going to add a component, and it's going to be a capsule collision. So this capsule collision is just going to be a little zone in front of it that we're going to use to determine whether we should be popping it out or not. So I'm just going to pull this up. Because my snap grid's too high, it popped all the way up top, so I'm just going to turn that off by clicking on the grid. So this is probably okay initially. We can clean this up later if we need to. So that's just there. And all we're going to do here is, in the event graph, I'm going to say on begin overlap. So this collision capsule overlaps all dynamic, and it generates overlap events, so it's correct. Now on begin overlap, we're going to check if the other actor is a ball. So I'm going to cast it to a BP ball, because we only really want this to do anything if it is a ball. Now, if it is a ball, what we want to do is add an impulse, which will automatically get me a reference to the ball mesh. And we're going to set that impulse to be equal to, this is a cheeky little way we can do this. If I click on this, you can see that the red arrow is pointing that way, which actually tells me my forward vector. And in this instance, all I actually really need to do is say I want to go this way. So if I tell this to go negative impulse on the forward vector, it'll push out against the red arrow here. So to do that, if I go and get my capsule, get forward vector, which is the red arrow, the x-axis, and I multiply this by a big number to give it some projection. So I'm going to multiply it against the float. That's just going to be set to, say, negative 2,500 sounds good. And I plug this into here. Cool. All I need to do now is do something to actually modify the static mesh's material. But first off, let's just double check that it works. So I'm going to go into the world. I'm just going to add a sling. This sling by default is quite small, so I'm just going to make it equal to, say, 2 times larger. In the process, I might move these around as well. And I'll get rid of you. Okay, so we can put this here. And if I alt drag it, we can now put another one over here. If I right click, I can transform. And I can mirror it as well, so we can get that nice, just 2 assets kind of popping up there. Actually, let's face it this way instead. That's nice. Cool, very simple. So to test this, I'm just going to now hit play. So that seems to have worked. We got a little bit of a bump out of it, but it's going to be a lot clearer as to whether it's working or not if we go ahead and add a quick timeline so that we can see the band kind of shoot out. So to modify the bands, all I'm going to do here is after I add an impulse, I'm going to get the static mesh and I'm going to change the variable in its material. Now, because I'm going to be changing a variable in its material, it's a good idea for me in my construction script to get this and just type create dynamic material instance. And when it asks me which one, I know that it's the channel 2. Remember, it's indexed by 0, so it's element 2. We can see that if we open up the mesh, element 0, 1, 2. So this is the one that we want to make an instance of. So I'm just going to quickly plug that in, and in my event graph, I'm going to get the material. It's going to be material 2. I'm then going to cast to dynamic, at which point I'm simply going to set scalar parameter to a value. Now, what we actually need to do here is we don't just want to set this value one time. Like, we don't just want to set it to the value of 1, for instance. What we actually want to do is set the value to be equal to something that we're projecting from a timeline. So I'm going to disconnect this here. Instead, I'm going to drag off, and I'm going to add a timeline. And this is just going to be called sling bounce. So update is going to be plugged into there. And we're going to double click on sling bounce and add a float parameter. And this is just going to be called bounce. And all we're going to do here is rather simple. We want this to be a way of adding a key at 0, 0, so I'm just going to set the time to 0. So this is where it starts, at which point we're going to right click, add a key. Keep in mind you can also shift click, just for me it's a force of habit for right clicking. So I'm going to add that there, and this is going to be equal to a value of, I want this to push out pretty substantially. I'll set it to 1 for the time being, but my gut says it'll end up as around 2. Now because this value here is linear, you can see that it's coming off like this. If I click on any of these and then hit 3, it'll automatically add that nice curve to them. So I actually want this to kind of spring out rather quickly and then kind of pop down. So I'm going to move this across. Also, if you're not sure which of these you want to use, you can open this up and set it to any of these. Auto's usually pretty good. So I've plugged this in, and we've now got a rather basic timeline. Compile, save. And if I was to go to my event graph and just connect bounce to here, it's now going to just interpolate that value. Now remember, we have to put in the parameter name of the value. And in our instance, the value is called %out. So I'm going to have to change this to say the word %out. At which point, when it gets hit and enters the capsule region, it should now eject. There you go, and you can see that popping out now. Now, one thing that we've gone and done is it will only play one time right now. And the reason it's only going to play one time is we're currently telling it to play. But we actually, every time this goes in, we want to get the elastic band and play it from the start again. So I'm just going to disconnect that and plug it into play on start instead. Compile, save. We should now have a fully functioning band. Pops out multiple times in a row. So we know that's working. The final thing that we really need to do is make sure that when we hit it, we know that it's the ball, that we add a score. So I'm going to add a quick function that's going to, I'm going to add a quick call that lets add a score to the game type. So we've already got this, we know. All I need to do is, after we've verified that it's ball, before I add the impulse, let's go ahead and quickly, I'm just going to move this across. I'm going to get the game mode. Cast a pinball game mode. If that somehow fails, which it shouldn't ever do, we'll just go straight through. But if, as long as it doesn't fail, let's go ahead and add score, which is that function that we've already created. Let's say these are worth 20 points. And just plug that in there. So that'll add score now every time. If I hit play. You can see it's adding a score. Fantastic. So the only other little thing that we really want to do here is go back to the mesh itself. And let's just quickly set up the materials to be just a little bit nicer. I'm going to set this to be a yellow band on top, and I'm going to set the middle one to just be simple metal, just so we've got a completed asset in there. Save. There you go. Now from here we're going to be doing some polish passes, so we're going to start adding sound effects to everything, as well as adding some particle effects where necessary. So stick around, jump into the next lesson. So aside from the materials, the other thing that we need to fix right now is the collision. So I'm going to click up here and view it, and you can see that this is currently set up so that it creates this very weird shape. So initially I'm going to click on that and hit delete. The other way you can do it is collision, then you can go to remove collision. There's nothing there at the moment, so it's grayed out. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to tell it that I want it to auto-generate collision based purely on this top piece. The rest of it's going to kind of throw it into confusion. So I'm going to go down to LOD 0, and just temporarily I'm going to turn off collision on the posts as well as on the band itself. So it's just on this top section here. I'm going to do convex collision set to around 20 max Helverts. Going to click apply, and then we just wait a second. Now keep in mind that what I generate here is only going to be on this top area, but I kind of actually want this to go the whole way down. So there's a nice little thing that I can do. If I click on it, you can see that it lets me select the collision. So I'm going to get this and drag it down, and then I'm going to hit spacebar, spacebar, and instead I'm now going to start scaling it upwards. Now, because of the offset between where this was and the ground, as I scale it, it's going to push it upwards, but that's okay. It's really only a thing that we need to kind of deal with once. So I'm just going to drag it this way until we get something that's about there, a little bit taller. So now we've gone ahead and just created a very simple collision block that goes from the top down to here, which should be a bit better for gameplay. So I'm going to hit save, and then we're done within the sling band itself.